In this video, let's discuss Poetics by Aristotle. As we know, Aristotle is a Greek philosopher of the classical period. Now, we don't know much about his life, but we understand that both of his parents died when he was very young, when he was just a teenager, and he was brought up by his guardian. And when he was 17 years old, Aristotle joined Plato's academy. He learned there for almost 20 years, up to he was 37 years old. While Aristotle was Plato's student, he was greatly influenced by Plato. But still, we find that in the views put forward by Aristotle, there are agreements with what Plato has given us, but there are also disagreements. So he had his own views, even though he was Plato's student. And after Plato's death, Aristotle started to tutor Alexander the Great. And soon he founded his school, Lyceum. He was also the founder of the Aristotelian tradition. He has been a very important philosopher, a very influential man in almost all fields. His writings cover many subjects like theatre, music, biology, psychology, politics, and so on. For example, in the field of biology, he has talked about the reproductive arm of the male octopus. But this was believed only in the 19th century when finally modern science could prove that, as Aristotle said, the reproductive organ in a male octopus was in one of its arms. And if we look at his contributions in the field of psychology, we can find that Aristotle has talked about dreams. That is, till the period of Aristotle, it was believed that dreams were something that was sent by the divine being, by God. But Aristotle argued that it was not the case. So Aristotle has contributed a lot to all fields, including literature. Two major works of Aristotle are Poetics and Rhetoric. Now, even though Aristotle wrote many elegant treatises and dialogues for publication, only one third of his original output survived. And whatever we have, these notes are written in the style of a lecture note. So, the style of these works are considered to be inferior to that of Plato's. But there are no doubts about the quality of its content and his influence. And thus, as a tribute to Aristotle, as an honor to him, because of Aristotle's influence, Dante, in his Divine Comedy, has called him the master of those who know. Here you can see the pictures of the great Greek philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. We already discussed about Aristotle's teacher Plato in the last video. According to Plato, art and literature is twice removed from reality, as it only copies something which is original. And he also says that mimetic art can be deceptive, and thus poets should be banished from his ideal state. Now, these were some allegations that Plato had put forward. Now, when we go through the poems in Aristotle's Poetics, you will find that there are certain points which Aristotle puts forward that defends poetry and stands against the ideas put forward by Plato. So, in a way, Aristotle is not only influenced, is not only a student of Plato, but he could be also seen as a rival who has his own opinions. Before we go into the details about Aristotle's Poetics, let's first look into an introduction. Now, Poetics contains 26 small chapters. It's more like a summary of all his lectures to his pupils. Now, we don't actually have the whole of Poetics. Scholars say that the second part of Poetics was lost when the library of Alexandria was burnt. And even the first part of this work seems incomplete. Now, this work is firmly rooted in Greek literature. That is, when Aristotle came into his conclusions, he studied the Greek literature. But yet, this could be applied to the whole of literature, the world literature as a whole. And Poetics is about Aristotle's theory of aesthetics. Now, even though this work is named Poetics, it is not mainly about poetry. Aristotle talks a lot about tragedy and also about epic poetry. Scholars believe that Aristotle had put forward his viewpoints about comedy in the second part to Poetics, but that part is closed. So we have received only very few points about comedy. We will begin with what Aristotle has to talk about poetry. Now, we already know that Plato did not have a very favorable approach to poets and poetry. He considered poets to be someone who are deceptive, and thus Plato wanted the poets to be banned from his ideal state. Let's see what was Aristotle's take on them. Let's first discuss mimesis and then move on to poetry as a mimetic art. Now, according to Plato, art is twice removed from reality. It is only a copy of a copy. That is, Plato did not favor mimesis. He saw mimetic art to be something that is deceptive, which can cheat people by showing that the poet knows what he doesn't actually know. But here, when Aristotle talks about mimesis in his work Poetics, he is in favor of mimesis. There are two important points that Aristotle conveys about mimesis. The first is that mimesis is natural and mimesis is not mere imitation, it is a craft. Firstly, he says mimesis is natural. Poetry is also a mimetic art. So he says poetry in general seems to have sprung from two causes, each of them lying deep in our nature. First, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood, one difference between him and other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons and no less universal in the pleasure felt in things imitated. That is, according to Aristotle, imitation is part of human nature. It is there inbuilt in us from our childhood. And he says that it is this instinct to imitate things, to imitate the people that we meet, that make us different from animals. And we also learn our earliest lessons, the first lessons in our life through imitation. So, imitation plays a huge role in human lives, and it also gives us some pleasure in imitating things and people. So, as said, there is a natural pleasure in imitation, and this makes a child to imitate and learn his earliest lessons in speech and behavior from the others around him. The same way, a poet or an artist is just a grown up child who imitates for the pleasure it affords. So the first point was mimesis or imitation is something that is natural. Now, secondly, Aristotle says that mimesis is not imitation. It is not simply copying something, it is a craft. That is, when a poet or an artist creates a work, there is something new about it, something imaginative about it. Not everybody can write a good poem, not everybody can paint a good picture. Thus, mimesis is not simply mirroring of an object. It should be studied and appreciated by itself as a craft. So, here, by supporting mimesis, Aristotle is also defending poetry. These ideas put forward by Aristotle could be also seen as a critique of Plato's views because in Aristotle's Poetics, Aristotle doesn't define what mimesis is. He straightforward goes on to telling that mimesis is natural and it is a craft. It is not simply mirroring of an object. Some scholars think that Aristotle did not feel the need to define mimesis again because it was already familiarized by Plato in his Republic. This could be only a continuation or a critique of mimesis of Plato's views. Now let's look into the function of poetry according to Aristotle. According to Plato, the function of poetry is to teach. Plato judged art and poetry and drama based on moral and philosophical grounds. Plato's opinion was that if a poetry couldn't teach moral values to the society, then it is not a good poetry. But here, on the contrary, Aristotle did not strictly want poetry to be something that teaches moral lessons to the people. It's not that Aristotle doesn't support Plato at all. He partly agrees and partly disagrees. Let's see how. Like Plato, Aristotle doesn't state that poetry should compulsorily teach, but this purpose is not ruled out. If a poem can please as well as teach, it will be regarded superior for its dual purpose. So, Aristotle did not strictly emphasize on Plato's idea that poetry should teach. Of course, according to him, the main purpose of poetry is to please the poet and the readers. But he doesn't say that teaching is not a purpose of poetry. If the poetry can please as well as teach, it is giving out dual purpose, and because of this, poetry will become superior. Aristotle also talks about the emotional appeal of poetry. Now, Plato used this as a drawback. He said poetry stirred emotions and suppressed the functioning of reason. Plato's point here is that if we train ourselves to cry while we read a sad poem, how can we use logic while we are in a sad real life situation? Thus, according to Plato, if we let our sense of pity grow strong by feeding upon the griefs of others, it is not easy to restrain it in the case of our own sufferings. Now, Aristotle did not have any such fears that poetry is going to make us irrational. It is going to take away our ability to make rational decisions. According to him, the emotions that we get, the emotional appeal of poetry, can create catharsis or purgation in the readers. For example, suppose a person is very sad. He has a lot of sadness in him. When he reads a sad poem and cries, this poem acts as a means for him to let go of all the sadness in him. Thus, it is a kind of catharsis, a kind of purification or purgation in the reader. So, the emotional appeal of poetry is not harmful according to Aristotle. It is health giving and artistically satisfying. Another important point about poetry that Aristotle puts forward is that poetry is more philosophical than history. If we look at a comparison between history and poetry, we find that a historian always writes about things that had already happened, the things in the past. Whereas in a poem, a poet talks about things that may happen. It is not something that had happened to someone, but it is something that has the possibility to happen. Also, history talks about something particular, about particular people, places, and things. Whereas poetry doesn't talk about anyone in particular, any place in particular. It talks about the universal by stressing on what they have in common with all persons, all places, or all things in the same set of circumstances. Thus, poetry has a wider reach, it has more depth. The pictures of poetry, therefore, are not mere reproductions of the facts, but truths that can be applied to all places and times. That is, poetry is universal. And this makes poetry more philosophical than history. So, these are Aristotle's views on poetry. Poetry as a mimetic art, the purpose of poetry, the emotional appeal of poetry, all these are not merely copied from what Plato had already said. Aristotle has either added his own views or he is critiquing what Plato had told earlier. So, here, if you notice, the difference between Plato and Aristotle in judging poetry is that Plato judged poetry based on moral grounds, whereas Aristotle saw poetry as an art. And Aristotle believed that art is something that is to be judged based on its own rules. So, this has brought all these differences between the views of Plato and Aristotle on poetry. Now, let's move on to tragedy. A major section of Poetics has been dedicated to tragedy. Aristotle has given a lot of importance to this topic. Tragedy is supposed to have originated from dithyrambic hymns which was sung by the choir praising the god Dionysus. So tragedy has originated from poetry. Not only tragedy but other literary forms like epic, satire and comedy has also originated from poetry. That is, poetry of the earlier times could be divided into two categories. The first being the poems that imitate noble actions of good men. From this group of poems, epic poetry originated, that is, poems that praises the actions of brave men and gods. And from this epic poetry, tragedy originated. The other category of poems was the poems that imitate mean actions of bad men. From this, satire and comedy originated. So, this is how tragedy originated. And according to Aristotle, tragedy is the most refined version of poetry. And it uses a dramatic form. Therefore, it is not to be told but to be shown. Let's move on to a definition given by Aristotle about tragedy. Tragedy is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear, affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. Okay, we will split this definition into its important components and then try to understand the meaning. Let's look into what Aristotle means when he uses these terms in the definition. First term is action. Action refers to all human activities including deeds, thoughts and feelings. By using the word serious, Aristotle means that tragedy should be a tale of suffering. It should excite pity and fear in the audience. He then uses the word complete. Complete means that the plot of the tragedy should be well knit with a beginning, middle, and end. There should be a natural sequence of events which cannot be disturbed. One event should follow the other just as how it is the effect of a cause. In case we can interchange the beginning, middle, and end. In that case, the plot is not complete. The tragedy is not complete. It is loose. A tragedy should also have a certain magnitude, that is, it should not be too short or too long. The length of the tragedy should be reasonable that the audience can comprehend whatever is happening on the stage. Aristotle says it should be of a length which can be easily embraced by the memory. And when he talks about artistic ornament, he means the rhythm, harmony, and so on, which is used to decorate or enrich the language of the play so that it will become effective as the audience watches it on the stage. Aristotle also talks about the form of tragedy, the form of action. That is, it is the dramatic form of tragedy that makes it different from an epic. Tragedy is different from an epic because of the difference in its form. Unlike the epic, where the story of the epic is being conveyed by the poet, tragedy is told with the help of living and moving characters. The speeches and the action make the tale, and the dramatist is nowhere to be seen. Thus, this form of action is also important for tragedy. So, the tragedy should have a main action which is serious. It should be something that excites pity and fear. And this tragedy should be complete. It should have a beginning, middle, and end. It should be also written in a reasonable length. The language should be enriched, and the form of tragedy is very important as it distinguishes tragedy from the epic. Going back to our definition, tragedy is an imitation. Yes, it came from imitative poetry. So it is an imitation of an action. There should be a main action that is serious. It should arouse pity and fear. Complete, it should have a beginning, middle, and end, and of a certain magnitude. It should not be too short or too long. In language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, meaning the rhyme, meter, etc., which is used to enrich the language. The several kinds being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, the form of the tragedy is very important. Through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. By bringing pity and fear, these two emotions, in the audience, the tragedy should be able to bring a catharsis, a purgation of these emotions in the audience. I hope the definition is now clear. Now let's look at the various parts or components of a tragedy. According to Aristotle, there are 6 constituent parts in tragedy. They are plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. And among these 6, the most important part of tragedy is the plot. Plot is the most important constituent part. And after that comes character, then thought, diction, and song, and then comes spectacle, which is the least important one. So these parts are arranged in order of their importance. Let's look into each of these parts in detail. The first and most important part is the plot. Plot is the arrangement of incidents in a tragedy. When the incidents are arranged in the correct sequence with good connection or effective link, that makes a good plot. So, how the events are arranged in the story, how one event leads to another. This arrangement of events or incidents is the plot. So, there should be a correct sequence and there should be also a good connection between these events. Plato calls plot as the soul of tragedy, the most important element of tragedy. He gives an example to show why plot is the most important one among all the six parts. That is, in the process of making a beautiful picture, the most important part is to make a beautiful and correct outline of the picture. The outline decides what the picture is going to be. So, the most beautiful pigments made on at random will not give as much pleasure as the black and white outline picture. So, the plot of a tragedy is similar to the black and white outline picture of a painting. And thus, it is very important. And then Aristotle gives certain points that has to be kept in mind while creating a good plot. Firstly, the plot must be a whole. As we told in the beginning, it should be complete. It should have a beginning, middle and end. It should be rightly sequenced and whatever problem is presented in the plot should be resolved by the end. And what about the magnitude or the length? The length of the plot should not be too long or too short. It should be such that the audience can remember the plot. A plot should also have certain amount of universality. That is, the plot should be close enough to real life. It should be probable. A story should be something that could happen in our real life. So it should remind the audience how one would have acted in the same situation if it had occurred to him or her. And most importantly, the plot should contain the three unities: the unity of time, the unity of place, and the unity of action. The three unities are also called Aristotelian unities or the classical unities. Now, what are these? Unity of action means a tragedy should have one principal action. The story should revolve around one principal action. And the next is unity of time. That is, whatever is the action that is taking place in tragedy, it should happen in a period of no more than 24 hours. The action should take place in a day. As far as possible, confine itself, the action, to a single revolution of the sun, says Aristotle. This is because when a tragedy is staged, it takes only few hours to complete the tragedy, the whole play. In that case, when the tragedy is talking about a story or a plot that is taking place over the years or over the months, it will not make sense to the audience. The third unity is unity of place. That is, a tragedy should exist in a single physical location. What Aristotle means is that when the audience watches the characters act out a tragedy on the stage, it doesn't make sense to them when one act of the tragedy is in Alexandria and the other act of the tragedy is in Egypt. Because throughout the play, the characters were on the same stage. So, a tragedy should be written in such a way that unity of place is maintained. So, in short, a play should have a single action represented as occurring in a single place and within the course of a single day. These are the classical unities or the three unities of Aristotle. The next component of tragedy is character. Tragedy is the imitation of an action, thought, or emotion. These aspects, the action, thoughts, or emotions that are imitated, belong to a certain man or woman. This object of imitation is the character. The protagonist or the main character of a tragedy is often called the tragic hero. There are certain qualities that the main character of a tragedy should possess, like he should be good, he should be renowned, courageous, loud, he should be real, consistent, and so on. But apart from all these good qualities, This character should have a flow in the character to make this whole script into a tragedy. This flow in the character of the tragic hero is called hamartia. After completing the parts of tragedy, we will look into detail about the tragic hero and his tragic flow. The next part of tragedy is thought. Thought imitates men's mental and emotional reactions to the circumstances in which they find themselves. Thought is important because actions spring out from thoughts. Action and speech are coexisting components of thoughts. The catharsis effect of the tragic play by arousing the feelings of pity and fear is ultimately the product of thought. So, whatever is happening in the mind of the characters, the mental and emotional reactions of the characters are being exposed. The thought is being exposed as actions in the play, and this brings a catharsis effect. So, the catharsis effect is ultimately the product of the thoughts. The next part is diction. Diction refers to the language and the style used to write the tragedy. The metrical arrangement of words in the play is called diction. 2 points should be kept in mind while using diction in tragedy. Firstly, the language should match the character. The nature, type, quality, and aptness of vocabulary used in tragedy should be proper and appropriate to the character, plot, and objective of the tragedy. And also, embellishments are welcome, but they should be used appropriately. That is, whatever decorations or embellishments are used in the play, it should be used when and where it is needed. Next, we have the song. We know that the musical elements of the chorus comes under song. It makes sense to everybody, and thus the viewers can appreciate it. Chorus keeps the melody of the play. Thus, Aristotle insists that chorus should be an integral part of the play. Finally, we have the last part or the least important part, the spectacle. Spectacular beauty arises when play is brought out with the artistic value. It is thus the automatic byproduct of a good play. We know when we watch a drama, when we watch a play, it is important that the play should have a good script first, a good plot, good characters first, in order to have a good spectacle in front of us. So, the last part, the spectacle, is like an automatic byproduct. If all the other parts are done well, then automatically spectacle will also be good. Aristotle says that the poet who focuses on the spectacle couldn't achieve the artistic beauty of the play, and thus it is least important. So, we have discussed all the parts of a tragedy. Now, let's move on to some terms. First, a tragic hero. A tragic hero is the protagonist or the main character of a tragedy. He must evoke a sense of pity and fear within the audience. And how are these emotions brought in the audience? The audience feel pity when they see that the tragic hero of the tragedy receives an undeserved misfortune. He was too good to be this misfortunate. That is when the audience feel this sense of pity. And they feel this fear when they realize that whatever the tragic hero is experiencing in the play is also possible for them in the real life. So there should be a change of fortune in the tragedy. But this change of fortune should not be from bad to good. Aristotle explains such change of fortune should not be from bad to good, but reversely, that is, from good to bad. That is, a person in a very high position, for example, a king or a noble person, should have a fortune change from good to bad. That is when the script becomes a tragedy. Thus, by bringing a change in the fortune of the tragic hero from good to bad, the playwright can produce the emotions, fear, and pity in the audience. This will create a catharsis, a purgation of emotions through the dramatic art in the audience. Why does this catharsis happen? It's because the audience are trying to relate with the character they are seeing in the play. Very often, the viewers identify themselves with the tragic hero. So it becomes an outlet for their suppressed emotions like fear, anger, hatred, and so on. So, even though the sufferings we see in the play are not our own, it's not our fortune that is going from good to bad, it's not our sufferings, but still we find a full and free outlet. And this will help us to relieve our soul of its excess emotions. This is how catharsis happens in the audience through the tragic hero. Next, let's look at what is peripeteia and anagnorisis. Peripeteia is an unexpected reversal of circumstances or a sudden change of fortune in the story. In Aristotle's words, it is a reversal of intention, a deed done in blindness, defeating its own purpose, a move to kill an enemy recoiling on one's own head, the effort to save turning into just its opposite, killing an enemy and discovering him to be a kinsman. Anagnorisis, on the other hand, is the recognition or discovery by the character. It is a change from ignorance to knowledge. For example, in Sophocles' tragedy, Oedipus killed his father and married his mother. This is peripeteia, an unexpected reversal of circumstances. When he realized that this is what he did, that part is anagnorisis, which is the recognition or the discovery of his actions, what actually happened. Now, based on whether the plot of a tragedy uses peripeteia and anagnorisis, plots can be simple or complex. In a simple plot, there are no puzzling situations. Like all plots, it will have a beginning, middle, and end, but it will not have peripeteia or anagnorisis. So, it is a simple plot. And when the plot uses these both, it becomes a complex plot. And according to Aristotle, a perfect tragedy should be arranged not on the simple but on the complex plot. These are the two other terms that we should know. We saw the two types of plots, simple and complex. Now, there are also two parts to plot. A plot can be divided into two parts, the complication or the rising action and the denouement or the falling action. The complication or the rising action includes all the action from the beginning to the point where it takes a turn for good or ill. All the surprises, the suspenses that take place till the tragedy reaches a point comes under complication. And after this comes the falling action, which is an unraveling of all the problems set in the first part. This extends from the turning point to the end. Now we will move on to comedy. As I mentioned before, the second part of Poetics is thought to be lost when the library of Alexandria was burned. So scholars believe that Aristotle's views on comedy was supposed to be in this book. So we do not know much about his views on comedy, but still there are some points. According to Aristotle, comedy represents men as worse than they are. But that doesn't mean that they are evil, they are just ridiculous and laughable. So, men who have some defect or ugliness which is not painful or destructive is being represented in comedy. Comedy ridicules general vices. Aristotle also notes that what they do, what the characters of the comedy do, should not lead to any pain or harm to themselves or to others. Only then will the play become a comedy. He then contrasts comedy with tragedy. Comedy represents men worse than they are, whereas tragedy represents men better than they are. Also, comedy does not evoke pity or fear in the audience. But in the case of tragedy, it is important to arouse pity and fear in the audience when they watch it. And if we look at the names given to the characters like brainworm or backbite, they suggest a section of humanity. It is not meant for the particular character only, but the character represents a section of the humanity. So they represent more or less the universal rather than the individual frailties. The characters should also be lovable, only then can they put us into good humor. So these are the major points that we know about comedy. And since the second half of Poetics is lost, we do not know much about Aristotle's opinions on comedy. Aristotle also discusses about epic poetry and how it differs from tragedy. So in Poetics, another topic that we have to learn is Aristotle's views on epic. So, according to Aristotle, like tragedy, epic poetry is also imitation of admirable people, people of high standard, high status. But he maintains that epic poetry isn't as highly regarded as tragedy. That is, tragedy is superior to epic poetry. And Aristotle says that the concentrated effect in tragedy is more pleasurable than one which is spread over a long time and so diluted. That is, epic poetry is too long, and whatever event is being explained, it is so diluted in the epic poetry. But the same thing, when it is presented as a tragedy, it is more concentrated and this is more pleasurable. And thus he says that tragedy is better than the epic. Now, if we look at the nature of epic poetry and tragedy, there are a lot of resemblances. But these both differ in their form. They are similar in their nature, but they differ in their form. Now, look at these points that come under the nature of epic. You will find that they are very similar to the nature of tragedy. Epic is an imitation of a serious action. It is whole and complete. It has a beginning, middle, and end, and so on. So, all these are similar to the nature of a tragedy. But when you look at the form of the epic, you will find why epic is different from tragedy. Epic imitates life by narration. It is lengthier than tragedy. It has no use for song and spectacle, which form part of acting. Conveyed through reading or recitation, many events can be simultaneously presented because it doesn't have to be staged, and thus as much of events wherever they want it to happen can be added to the epic. So in this class we have learned about Aristotle's views on poetry, tragedy, comedy and epic. We also saw how his views are different or even similar to that of Plato's. So, despite its shortcomings, we discussed in the beginning that Poetics is written like lecture notes. So, it is thought to be inferior to Plato's works in style. But still, it is thought to be an important landmark in the history of literary criticism. Because, in order to understand the literary history, it is important to know poetics. Without a proper knowledge on Aristotle and his poetics, it might become difficult to understand the criticisms that came after. And just as how we say Shakespeare is for all ages, Aristotle's Poetics is thought by scholars to last much longer. It is for all ages. Again, just to remind you, Poetics is not simply about poetry. The main topic of discussion in Poetics is tragedy. So that's all for this video. I have tried to include all the important points and I hope you have all understood. Please let me know in the comment section if the video was useful to you. Please do like, share, subscribe and share it with your friends. Thank you so much for watching.